Lieutenant Colonel Derek Thompson stood in his new driveway, watching his teenage son Carlos carry boxes into their dream home. After 20 years of military service, Derek had finally found the perfect place for his family. The suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook seemed like paradise. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained houses, and the kind of safety he'd fought to protect overseas. His wife Lisa emerged from the house, wiping sweat from her forehead. "The kitchen is going to be beautiful once we get everything unpacked," she said with a smile that made Derek's heart warm. Their daughter Sophia ran past them, already making friends with kids from down the street. This was exactly what Derek had dreamed of during those long nights in foreign countries. Derek had made a conscious decision to keep his military background quiet. When neighbors asked about his work, he simply said he worked for the government. No need to mention the classified missions, the dangerous operations, or the fact that he commanded one of the most elite units in the American military. Here in Willowbrook, he just wanted to be a regular dad who helped with homework and coached soccer games. The neighborhood welcomed them warmly at first. Mrs. Rodriguez next door brought over homemade cookies. The family across the street invited them to a barbecue. Derek helped Mr. Peterson fix his fence without being asked. On weekends, he volunteered to coach Little League baseball, something he'd always wanted to do but never had time for during his deployments. Life felt normal for the first time in years. Derek would wake up early, not for military drills, but to make breakfast for his family. He'd drive Sophia and Carlos to school, then head to his new job at a private security consulting firm. The work was easier than what he was used to, but it paid well and kept him close to home. In the evenings, the family would sit around their dinner table, something that had been rare when Derek was deployed overseas. They'd talk about school, friends, and weekend plans. Lisa had started a new job at the local hospital, and she loved working with patients again. The kids were adjusting well to their new school, making friends and joining clubs. Derek often found himself standing in his backyard, looking at the peaceful suburban scene around him. Children played in yards while parents watched from porches. The sound of lawnmowers and barbecue grills filled the air. It was everything he'd imagined when he was serving in dangerous places around the world. The house itself was perfect for their needs. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a big kitchen where Lisa could cook, and a basement where Derek could set up a small home gym. The backyard was large enough for family gatherings, and there was even a small garden where Lisa had started growing vegetables. Derek had saved money carefully during his military career, and the VA loan had made the house affordable. He was proud that he could provide this kind of life for his family. After years of moving from base to base, never knowing when the next deployment would come, having a permanent home felt like the greatest victory of his career. The community seemed to accept them as just another family. Derek would wave to neighbors while getting his mail, help elderly residents carry groceries, and chat with other parents at school events. He joined the Neighborhood Watch program and attended community meetings. This was the American dream he'd fought to protect, and now he was finally living it. But Derek's military training had taught him to stay alert, even in peaceful situations. He noticed which neighbors were home during the day, which cars belonged to visitors, and which routes his kids took to school. It wasn't paranoia, it was just habit. After 2 decades of keeping soldiers safe, protecting his own family came naturally. Lisa sometimes teased him about being too careful. "You're not in a war zone anymore," she'd say, when she caught him checking the locks twice before bed. But Derek couldn't completely turn off the part of his brain that was always watching, always ready to respond to threats. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, leading missions that most people couldn't even imagine. Now surrounded by white picket fences and soccer moms, he felt more relaxed than he had in years. This was what peace looked like, and he was determined to protect it for his family. Derek never talked about his war experiences with his new neighbors. They didn't need to know about the medals in his closet or the commendations from generals. Here he was just Derek, the guy who helped with school fundraisers and remembered everyone's kids' names. That was exactly how he wanted it. It was a beautiful Saturday morning when everything changed. Derek was outside washing his truck, enjoying the warm sunshine and the peaceful neighborhood sounds. He'd woken up early, made pancakes for the family, and decided to tackle some chores around the house. The truck needed cleaning after a week of driving through construction zones for work. He was humming quietly to himself, thinking about taking the family to the lake later that afternoon, when a police car slowly rolled down the street. Derek glanced up briefly but didn't think much of it. Police patrols were normal in any neighborhood. He continued scrubbing the wheels, focused on getting every bit of dirt off his vehicle. The police car stopped directly in front of his house. 2 officers got out and walked toward him with purpose. Derek straightened up, water dripping from his hands, wondering if there had been some kind of emergency in the neighborhood. Maybe someone's house had been broken into, or they were looking for witnesses to an accident. "Excuse me, sir," said the first officer, a man with short brown hair and an unfriendly expression. His name tag read Officer Williams. The second officer, taller and broader, positioned himself slightly to the side. Derek noticed their body language immediately. This wasn't a friendly community check-in. "Good morning, officers," Derek replied politely, setting down his sponge. "Is everything all right? Did something happen in the neighborhood?" Officer Williams looked Derek up and down before speaking. "We received a report about suspicious activity in this area. Someone called about a person who didn't seem to belong here." Derek felt a chill run down his spine, but he kept his voice calm and respectful. "I live here, officer. This is my house. My family and I moved in about 6 weeks ago." The second officer, whose name tag read Rodriguez, stepped closer. "Can you prove that? Do you have any identification?" Derek's military training kicked in. He recognized the tone, the posture, the way they were treating him. But he also knew that escalating the situation would only make things worse. "Of course," he said calmly. "My wallet is inside the house. Would you like me to get it?" Slowly, Officer Williams said, as if Derek might suddenly become dangerous. Derek walked to his front door, very aware that both officers were watching his every move. Inside, Lisa was reading a book in the living room. She looked up with concern when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" she whispered. "Police want to see my ID," Derek said quietly, grabbing his wallet from the kitchen counter. "Everything's fine." But Lisa followed him to the window and watched as he handed his driver's license to the officers. Derek could see her face growing worried as the officers spent several minutes examining his identification and talking into their radio. "So you live at this address?" Officer Williams asked, even though the license clearly showed Derek's current address. "Yes, sir. That's my wife inside, and our 2 kids are upstairs doing homework." Officer Rodriguez looked at the house, then back at Derek. "What kind of work do you do? How can you afford a place like this?" The question hit Derek like a slap. He'd bought this house with money he'd saved during 20 years of military service, using a VA loan he'd earned by putting his life on the line for his country. But he kept his voice steady. "I work in security consulting," Derek answered truthfully. The officers exchanged a look that Derek didn't like. "Security consulting," Officer Williams repeated, as if the words tasted bad in his mouth. "That's pretty vague." Derek felt his jaw tighten slightly, a reaction Lisa would have recognized as a warning sign. In his military days, that expression meant Derek was using every ounce of self-control to avoid doing something he might regret. But these officers had no way of knowing they were dealing with someone who had commanded elite soldiers in life-or-death situations. "I help businesses improve their security systems," Derek explained, which was technically true, though it barely scratched the surface of his actual qualifications. Officer Rodriguez handed back the license. "We'll be keeping an eye on things in this neighborhood," he said in a tone that felt more like a threat than a promise of protection. "Of course," Derek replied. "We all want to keep the community safe." After the officers left, Derek stood in his driveway for a long moment, processing what had just happened. He'd faced enemy fighters, navigated political minefields in foreign countries, and made split-second decisions that saved lives. But this encounter in his own driveway in front of his own home left him feeling something he hadn't experienced in years. Helpless. Lisa came outside, her face full of questions. What was that about? Derek looked at his house, at the American flag he'd hung by the front door, at the neighborhood where he'd hoped his children could grow up safely. "I'm not sure," he said quietly, "but I have a feeling it won't be the last time." That night, Derek lay awake thinking about the encounter. He'd served his country with honor, earned the respect of soldiers and commanders, and proven himself in the most challenging situations imaginable. But in his own neighborhood on a peaceful Saturday morning, he'd been treated like a threat simply for existing in his own space. He didn't tell his children about what happened. They were happy here, making friends and doing well in school. But Derek made a mental note to document the incident just in case. His military training had taught him that patterns often emerged from seemingly isolated events. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that his peaceful new life was about to become much more complicated. What Derek had hoped was a one-time misunderstanding turned into a pattern that made his stomach sink with each new incident. It started small, so small that he almost convinced himself he was being paranoid. But his military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. The first sign came 3 days after the driveway encounter. Carlos was walking home from school, backpack slung over his shoulder when the same police car pulled up beside him. Derek only learned about it when his son came home looking shaken and confused. "Dad, the police stopped me today," Carlos said, dropping his backpack by the front door. "They asked me where I lived and what I was doing in this neighborhood." Derek felt his chest tighten. "What did you tell them?" "I showed them my student ID and told them our address. They made me wait while they called it in to someone." "It was embarrassing, Dad. Other kids from school saw the whole thing." Derek put his hand on his son's shoulder. "You did exactly the right thing. Always be respectful and cooperative with police even when they're wrong." But inside, Derek was furious. His son was a good kid. Honor roll student, played on the school basketball team, volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. The idea that he was being treated as suspicious simply for walking through his own neighborhood was infuriating. The incidents kept coming. 2 weeks later, Lisa called Derek at work, her voice shaking with anger. "They followed me during my run," she said. "A police car slowly drove behind me for 6 blocks. When I stopped and asked if everything was okay, they said they were ensuring my safety because this was a changing neighborhood." Derek closed his office door. "Are you sure they were following you?" "Derek, I'm not paranoid. I took 3 different turns to see if they'd follow, and they did. It was deliberate." That weekend, Sophia and her new friends were hanging out at the local park when officers approached them. The other kids were told they could go, but Sophia was asked to show identification and explain why she was really in the area. By the time Derek arrived to pick her up, his daughter was in tears. "I don't understand, Dad," Sophia said as they drove home. "Jenny and Rachel didn't have to show their IDs. The officers acted like I was lying about living here." Derek gripped the steering wheel tighter. His daughter was 14 years old, a straight-A student who played violin in the school orchestra. She shouldn't have to experience this kind of treatment. Each incident followed the same pattern. The officers were always polite on the surface, always had a reasonable explanation for their actions. They were just checking on things or responding to reports or ensuring everyone's safety. But Derek recognized the tactics. It was systematic harassment designed to make his family feel unwelcome and unsafe. Derek started keeping detailed notes of every encounter. He wrote down dates, times, officer names when possible, and exact conversations. His military background had taught him the importance of documentation, and he had a feeling he was going to need evidence of what was happening. The breaking point came when Derek decided to file a formal complaint at the police station. He dressed professionally, gathered his documentation, and went to speak with a supervisor. The desk sergeant, a man named Reynolds with graying hair and tired eyes, listened to Derek's concerns with obvious skepticism. "So let me get this straight," Sergeant Reynolds said, leaning back in his chair. "You're complaining because our officers are doing their jobs? We've had increased patrols in your area because residents have expressed concerns about crime." Derek kept his voice calm and professional. "My family has been stopped and questioned multiple times for no apparent reason. My children are being singled out while their friends are not. This feels like targeted harassment," Reynolds shrugged. "Maybe you should feel grateful that we're keeping a close eye on things. Crime has been increasing in neighborhoods like yours. Our officers are just being proactive." The phrase "neighborhoods like yours" hung in the air between them. Derek understood exactly what the sergeant meant, and the implication made his blood boil. But he maintained his composure. "I'd like to file a formal complaint and request that these incidents be investigated," Derek said firmly. You can fill out a form, Reynolds said dismissively, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. But I wouldn't expect much to come of it. Our officers follow proper procedures. Derek filled out the complaint form carefully, documenting each incident with military precision. But as he walked out of the police station, he knew the paper would probably end up in a trash can. The system was protecting itself, not his family. That evening, Derek sat his family down for an honest conversation. Lisa could see the stress in his face, and the kids had been asking more and more questions about why police kept bothering them. I want you all to know that what's happening to us isn't right, Derek said carefully. But I also want you to understand that we need to be smart about how we handle it. Why are they doing this to us, Dad? Carlos asked. We haven't done anything wrong. Derek chose his words carefully. Sometimes people make assumptions about others based on what they look like or where they think they belong. It's not fair and it's not right, but it's reality. So what do? Sophia asked. We document everything. We stay respectful and cooperative. And we remember that this is our home, our neighborhood, and our community. We have every right to be here. But privately, Derek was growing more concerned. The harassment was escalating, becoming more frequent and more brazen. His family was starting to feel afraid in their own neighborhood, and that was exactly the opposite of what he'd wanted when they moved here. Derek had faced enemy combatants, navigated complex military operations, and made decisions under extreme pressure. But protecting his family from this kind of systematic intimidation felt more challenging than anything he'd encountered on the battlefield. As he tucked Sophia into bed that night, she asked quietly, Dad, are we going to have to move? Derek kissed her forehead. No, sweetheart. This is our home. We're not going anywhere. But as he said the words, Derek wondered if he'd be able to keep that promise. The call came at 7:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. Derek was helping Sophia with her algebra homework when his phone rang. Lisa answered it first, and Derek watched her face go pale. What do you mean you have our son? Lisa said into the phone, her voice rising with panic. Carlos is just walking home from basketball practice. Derek jumped up, grabbing the phone from his wife's trembling hands. This is Derek Thompson. Where is my son? Mr. Thompson, this is Sergeant Reynolds at the Willowbrook Police Department. Your son is here at the station. You need to come pick him up. Derek's military training kicked in immediately. Is he hurt? What happened? What is he being charged with? Just come down to the station, Mr. Thompson. We'll explain everything when you get here. The drive to the police station felt like the longest 10 minutes of Derek's life. Lisa sat beside him, crying quietly and asking questions he couldn't answer. Derek's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Carlos was a good kid who had never been in any kind of trouble. At the station, Sergeant Reynolds met them at the front desk, with the same dismissive attitude Derek remembered from his complaint visit. Your son was detained for questioning in connection with several car break-ins in the area. Car break-ins? Derek said, barely containing his anger. Carlos was at basketball practice. He was walking straight home. 2 of our officers saw him in the area where the break-ins occurred. He matched the description of the suspect. Derek felt his jaw clench. What description? Reynolds looked uncomfortable. Young male, approximately 17 years old, dark complexion. That describes half the teenagers in this city, Derek said coldly. Where is my son? They were led to a small room where Carlos sat at a metal table, still wearing his basketball uniform. Derek's heart broke when he saw his son's face. There was a bruise forming on his left cheek and his uniform shirt was torn at the shoulder. What happened to him? Lisa demanded, rushing to Carlos's side. Your son resisted when officers attempted to detain him, Reynolds said casually. He became combative. Derek looked at his son, who shook his head slightly. Carlos had been raised to respect authority and avoid confrontation. The idea that he had become combative was absurd. I want to see the arrest report, Derek said firmly. And I want to know why my son has injuries. There was no arrest, Reynolds said quickly. This was just a detention for questioning. Your son is free to go. Derek helped Carlos stand up, noticing how his son favored his left side. We're leaving now. Mr. Thompson, Reynolds called as they headed for the door. I hope you understand that we're just doing our jobs. Crime in your neighborhood has been increasing, and we have to investigate every lead. Derek turned back and, for the first time, let some of his military authority show through. My son was walking home from school activities in his own neighborhood. There was no crime being committed. This was harassment, pure and simple. In the car, Carlos finally broke down and told them what really happened. He'd been 3 blocks from home when officers Williams and Rodriguez pulled up beside him. They'd ordered him to stop and put his hands on their car. When Carlos asked why and tried to call his parents, they'd grabbed him roughly and pushed him against the vehicle. "I wasn't resisting, Dad," Carlos said, his voice shaking. "I was just scared. When Officer Williams pushed me against the car, I asked him to stop because he was hurting my shoulder. That's when he said I was being combative." Derek's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His son had been assaulted by police officers for the crime of walking home from basketball practice. The same officers who had been harassing his family for weeks had now crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Did anyone see what happened?" Derek asked. Mrs. Chen from down the street was getting her mail. She looked really upset when she saw them putting me in the police car. When they got home, Derek immediately called their neighbor. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had always been kind to their family, confirmed Carlos's story. She'd watched the entire incident from her front yard and was shocked by the officer's aggressive behavior. "That boy did nothing wrong," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "He was just walking down the sidewalk in his basketball uniform." Those officers were completely out of line. Derek asked if she'd be willing to provide a witness statement, and Mrs. Chen agreed immediately. "What happened to Carlos was wrong. I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years and I've never seen police treat anyone like that." That night, Derek couldn't sleep. He paced the house, checking on his children multiple times and thinking about what had happened. His son, an honor student, an athlete, a kid who volunteered at animal shelters, had been brutalized by police officers who were supposed to protect and serve. Lisa found him in the kitchen at 2 a.m., staring out the window at the quiet street. "What are we going to do?" she asked softly. Derek turned to face his wife. In 20 years of military service, he'd never felt as angry as he did right now. But his anger was controlled, focused, and purpose-driven. Exactly the kind of anger that had made him an effective military commander. "We're going to fight back," Derek said quietly, "but we're going to do it the right way." "Should we call a lawyer?" "Yes, but first I'm going to make some calls. It's time for this community to know what's really happening here." Derek had spent his military career protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. He'd led soldiers in combat zones and brought them home safely. Now, his own family needed that same level of protection, and Derek was going to provide it. The harassment had been escalating for weeks, but attacking his son was a mistake. These officers had no idea who they were dealing with, but they were about to find out. Derek looked at the American flag hanging by his front door, the same flag he'd served under for 2 decades. He'd fought overseas to protect the freedoms that flag represented. Now he was going to fight at home to ensure his family could enjoy those same freedoms. The battle was just beginning, and Derek Thompson was ready for war. The story of what happened to Carlos spread through Willowbrook faster than Derek had expected. Mrs. Chen, despite being in her 70s, was apparently well connected in the neighborhood social network. By Thursday morning, Derek's phone was ringing constantly with calls from concerned neighbors. The first call came from Janet Morrison, who lived 2 streets over. "Derek, I heard about what happened to Carlos," she said, her voice filled with outrage. "I want you to know that my family stands with yours. What those officers did was completely unacceptable." Derek was surprised by her support. He'd met Janet at a few community events, but they weren't particularly close. "I appreciate that, Janet, really." "Actually, Derek, I'm calling because something similar happened to my neighbor's son last month. The Patel family. Their boy Raj was stopped 3 times in 1 week while riding his bike through the neighborhood. I thought it was strange, but now I'm wondering if there's a pattern." That afternoon, Derek received a call that would change everything. "Mr. Thompson, this is Dr. Amanda Foster. I'm a civil rights attorney and I live in Willowbrook Heights, just a few blocks from you." Derek had heard of Dr. Foster. She was a prominent lawyer who had made national news for taking on high-profile discrimination cases. He never imagined she lived so close to him. "Dr. Foster, I didn't know you lived in the area. I moved here 6 months ago for the same reasons you did. Good school, safe neighborhood, quiet community. But I've been hearing troubling stories about selective police enforcement. After what happened to your son, I think we need to have a serious conversation." They met that evening at Derek's house. Dr. Foster was a sharp, professional woman in her 40s who listened carefully as Derek recounted every incident his family had experienced. She took detailed notes and asked precise questions that showed she understood exactly what was happening. "This isn't just harassment," Dr. Foster said firmly. "This is a systematic pattern of civil rights violations. And based on what I'm hearing from other neighbors, your family isn't the only target." "What do you mean?" Dr. Foster pulled out a folder. "I've been quietly documenting complaints from several families in this area. The Patel family you mentioned, the Johnson family on Oak Street, the Martinez family near the community center, all minority families, all reporting similar patterns of harassment by the same group of officers." Derek felt his anger building, but also a sense of validation. He wasn't paranoid or oversensitive. This was real and it was widespread. "What can we do about it?" Derek asked. "We fight back, legally, systematically, and very publicly." Dr. Foster leaned forward. "I'm willing to take your case pro bono, Derek, but I think we can do more than just file a lawsuit. I think we can expose this entire operation and make sure it never happens to another family." That weekend, Dr. Foster organized a community meeting at the local library. Derek was amazed by how many people showed up. Not just the families who had been harassed, but neighbors of all backgrounds who were outraged by what they'd learned. Mrs. Chen stood up first, her voice strong despite her age. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. I've seen it change and grow, and I've always been proud to call it home. But what I witnessed happening to the Thompson boy was disgraceful. This is not the community I know and love." One by one, other neighbors shared their stories. The Patel family described months of harassment. The Johnsons talked about their teenage daughter being followed by police while jogging. The Martinez family revealed that they'd been considering moving because of the constant surveillance and questioning. But Derek was most surprised by the support from neighbors he'd never expected. Bob Peterson, a retired police officer who lived across the street, stood up with tears in his eyes. "I wore a badge for 35 years, Peterson said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I know good policing from bad policing, and what's happening in our neighborhood is a disgrace to everything that badge is supposed to represent." The meeting ended with the formation of a neighborhood coalition called Willowbrook United. They planned a peaceful protest for the following Saturday, starting at the community center and marching to the police station. More importantly, they decided to make the story public by inviting local news media to cover their concerns. Derek found himself reluctantly thrust into a leadership role. Neighbors looked to him for guidance, though they had no idea about his military background. To them, he was just a concerned father who was articulate and organized. "We need to be strategic about this," Derek told the group. "Emotion alone won't create change. We need documentation, evidence, and a clear message about what we want to see happen." Dr. Foster worked with Derek to compile a comprehensive report documenting dozens of incidents over the past year. They had witness statements, police report numbers, and a clear timeline showing escalating harassment of minority families in the neighborhood. The story caught the attention of Channel 7 investigative reporter Patricia Williams, who had won awards for her coverage of police misconduct cases. She interviewed Derek, Dr. Foster, and several other affected families for a series of reports that would air the week of the protest. "This appears to be a textbook case of discriminatory policing," Williams said during her interview with Derek. "Multiple families, all minorities, all reporting similar patterns of harassment by the same officers in the same neighborhood. Social media played a huge role in spreading awareness. The Willowbrook United Facebook page grew from 50 members to over 2,000 in just 3 days. People shared stories, offered support, and pledged to attend the protest. The hashtag The Willowbrook United began trending locally. Derek's phone rang constantly with interview requests, offers of support, and messages from people in other neighborhoods who had experienced similar problems. It was overwhelming, but also encouraging. They weren't alone in this fight. Lisa was amazed by the response. "I never expected this many people to care," she said as they prepared signs for the protest. "People do care," Derek replied. "They just needed someone to speak up first." The night before the protest, Derek stood in his backyard looking at his house, his neighborhood, and thinking about how much had changed in just a few weeks. He'd moved here seeking peace and quiet for his family. Instead, he'd found himself leading a civil rights movement. But Derek realized that this fight was bigger than just his family's safety. It was about the kind of community Willowbrook would be, and whether families like his would be welcome and protected here. As he watched his neighbors' houses, many with Willowbrook United signs in their yards, Derek felt something he hadn't experienced since his military days: the power of good people coming together for a just cause. Tomorrow's protest would send a message that discrimination and harassment wouldn't be tolerated in their community. Derek was ready to lead that charge, even if these officers and officials still had no idea who they were really dealing with. The protest on Saturday brought out over 500 people, far more than Derek had expected. Families from all backgrounds marched peacefully from the community center to the police station, carrying signs that read "Equal Protection Under Law" and "Our Neighborhood, Our Rights." The crowd was diverse, united, and determined. Channel 7 reporter Patricia Williams was there with her camera crew, conducting interviews and documenting the march. Local newspapers sent photographers. Even some regional news outlets picked up the story. Derek found himself speaking to reporters, explaining their concerns and emphasizing that this wasn't anti-police. It was pro-accountability. "We support good policing," Derek told the cameras. "But what our families have experienced goes far beyond legitimate law enforcement. This is systematic harassment designed to make certain families feel unwelcome in their own neighborhood." The protest remained peaceful and dignified, exactly what Derek had hoped for. But the real work was happening behind the scenes, where Dr. Foster and Patricia Williams were digging deeper into the police department's practices. Williams had filed multiple Freedom of Information Act requests, seeking records on officers Williams and Rodriguez. What she discovered was disturbing. Both officers had been the subject of numerous complaints over the past 3 years, but those complaints had been systematically dismissed or buried by their supervisors. "Look at this pattern." Williams showed Derek and Dr. Foster the documents she'd obtained. Officer Williams has had 16 complaints filed against him in 2 years. Excessive force, harassment, discriminatory treatment, all dismissed as unfounded or unsubstantiated. Derek studied the paperwork with the analytical mind of a military strategist. These aren't random incidents. Look at the neighborhoods where the complaints originated. All diverse communities, all middle-class areas where these officers wouldn't expect organized resistance. Dr. Foster pointed to another troubling pattern. Both officers have been transferred between precincts multiple times. Every time complaints build up in one area, they're quietly moved somewhere else. The department isn't disciplining them. They're just relocating the problem. But the biggest breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen had mentioned seeing security cameras in the neighborhood, and Derek had asked Dr. Foster to help them obtain footage from the night Carlos was arrested. The security video from 3 different houses told a story that completely contradicted the police report. The footage clearly showed Carlos walking calmly down the sidewalk when the police car pulled up. It showed him cooperating fully when ordered to stop. Most damaging of all, it showed Officer Williams grabbing Carlos roughly and slamming him against the car, even though the boy was offering no resistance whatsoever. "This is assault," Dr. Foster said grimly as they watched the footage. "Clear, documented assault of a minor by a police officer. And they lied about it in their report." Derek felt his military training taking over as he analyzed the evidence. "We need to organize this information systematically. Timeline, witnesses, documentation, video evidence. We need to build a case so strong that it can't be ignored or dismissed." Williams's investigation revealed even more disturbing information. She'd found complaints against officers Williams and Rodriguez going back to their time at 2 previous precincts. The pattern was always the same: harassment of minority families in middle-class neighborhoods, complaints that were dismissed by supervisors, and eventual transfers when the heat got too intense. "This isn't just bad policing," Williams explained during one of their strategy meetings. "This is institutional racism with the protection of police leadership." These officers have been allowed to operate this way for years because nobody with power has been willing to stop them. Derek discovered that other neighborhoods had experienced similar problems. Dr. Foster connected him with civil rights attorneys in 3 other cities who were dealing with comparable cases involving the same patterns of behavior. "The good news is that you're not alone," one of the attorneys told Derek during a conference call. "The bad news is that these patterns are more widespread than most people realize. Departments often protect problematic officers by moving them around rather than addressing the root problems. Meanwhile, Derek was learning more about his own neighbor's experiences. Bob Peterson, the retired police officer, revealed that he'd tried to file complaints about Williams and Rodriguez months earlier, but had been told by department supervisors to mind his own business. "I know what I saw," Peterson told Derek privately. "These officers were targeting families based on race, plain and simple. When I tried to speak up through proper channels, I was essentially told to shut up." Dr. Foster was building a federal civil rights case that would go far beyond Derek's family. She'd documented similar harassment of at least 12 families over an 18-month period. The evidence showed a clear pattern of discriminatory enforcement that violated multiple federal laws. "We're not just suing for damages," Dr. Foster explained. "We're seeking a federal investigation of the entire department. This goes beyond two bad cops. This is about a system that protects and enables them." Patricia Williams's investigative series was scheduled to air the following week, and Derek knew it would bring national attention to their case. He'd been contacted by reporters from CNN and MSNBC who wanted to interview him about the broader issues of police, accountability, and community organizing, but Derek was still keeping his military background private. To the media and community, he was simply a concerned father and government consultant who had become an unlikely civil rights leader. He'd made a strategic decision not to reveal his military service unless absolutely necessary. "Why don't you tell them about your military background?" Lisa asked one evening as Derek prepared for another television interview. "It would give you more credibility." Derek considered the question carefully. "Right now, this story is about ordinary families fighting for their rights. If I reveal my military service, the focus shifts to me personally. I want the focus to stay on the issues in the community." The investigation was gaining momentum, but Derek knew they were approaching a critical point. The police department and city officials were starting to respond to the pressure, making public statements about isolated incidents and thorough investigations. Derek recognized these as standard political responses, designed to deflect attention rather than address problems. That's when Dr. Foster brought him news that changed everything. "Derek, I've been contacted by the FBI. They want to open a federal civil rights investigation based on our evidence." Derek felt a surge of satisfaction. His military experience had taught him that successful operations required overwhelming force applied at the right moment. They'd gathered their evidence, built their coalition, and documented their case. Now federal law enforcement would investigate the local law enforcement that had failed his family. But Derek also knew that involving the FBI would escalate the situation dramatically. The police department and city officials would no longer be able to dismiss this as a local community issue. This was about to become a federal case with national implications. "Are you ready for that level of scrutiny?" Dr. Foster asked. "Once the FBI gets involved, this story gets much bigger. There will be intense media attention, political pressure, and very aggressive pushback from the police union and city officials." Derek thought about his family, his neighborhood, and all the other families who had suffered similar harassment. He thought about Carlos's bruised face and Sophia's tears. He thought about the documentation he'd gathered and the community he'd helped organize. "Yes," Derek said firmly. "We're ready. It's time to finish this fight." The Willowbrook City Council meeting was packed beyond capacity. Derek had never seen the community center so crowded, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The FBI investigation had been announced that morning, and everyone wanted to hear what city officials would say about the police harassment scandal. Derek sat in the front row with Dr. Foster, Patricia Williams, and several other affected families. He'd spent the day doing interviews with national news outlets, carefully explaining the community's concerns while maintaining his cover as simply a concerned parent and government consultant. Mayor Richardson opened the meeting by acknowledging the concerns that have been raised and promising a thorough review of police procedures. It was exactly the kind of political non-answer Derek had expected. City Councilman Robert Hayes spoke next, and his comments made Derek's blood boil. "While we always take community concerns seriously," Hayes said in a condescending tone, "we must also recognize that our police officers have a difficult job. They're dealing with increased crime rates and growing challenges in maintaining public safety." Derek felt Lisa squeeze his hand as Hayes continued his speech, which was clearly designed to defend the police department while minimizing the community's complaints. "We've seen this pattern before," Hayes said, looking directly at Derek and the other affected families. Outside agitators come into peaceful communities, stirring up trouble and making accusations that divide neighbors who have lived together harmoniously for years. The phrase outside agitators hit Derek like a physical blow. He'd heard those same words used to dismiss civil rights movements throughout American history. The implication that he and his family were troublemakers who didn't belong in Willowbrook was exactly the attitude that had created this problem. In the first place, Dr. Foster leaned over to whisper in Derek's ear, "Let me respond to this. Don't let him bait you into an emotional reaction." But Derek was beyond careful political responses. Hayes had just called him an outside agitator in front of hundreds of his neighbors, dismissing everything his family had endured and everything the community had accomplished. It was time to set the record straight. Derek stood up slowly, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. The room fell silent as he walked toward the microphone, his presence commanding immediate attention in a way that surprised even him. "Councilman Hayes," Derek said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "You just called me an outside agitator. I think it's time this community knew exactly who you're talking about." Hayes looked uncomfortable, clearly not expecting to be challenged directly. "Mr. Thompson, I wasn't referring to you specifically." "Yes, you were," Derek interrupted, his voice calm but unmistakably powerful. "You looked directly at me when you said it. So let me introduce myself properly to everyone here tonight." Derek turned to face the packed room, and when he spoke, it was with the same commanding presence he'd used to address troops before critical missions. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Derek Thompson, United States Army Special Forces. I've served this country for 20 years in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. I've led soldiers in combat operations that most of you couldn't imagine. I've been awarded the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and the Distinguished Service Cross for actions in defense of American freedom." The room was completely silent. Derek could see shock on faces throughout the audience, including several city council members who were clearly hearing this information for the first time. "I moved my family to Willowbrook for the same reason many of you did, to find a safe, peaceful community where my children could grow up with the freedoms I spent 2 decades fighting to protect. But instead of peace, my family has been systematically harassed by police officers who treated us like criminals for the crime of existing in our own neighborhood." Derek's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Councilman Hayes calls me an outside agitator, but I've served this country longer than some of you have lived in this community. I've shed blood for the Constitution that guarantees all Americans equal protection under the law. And I'm not going to stand quietly while that Constitution is violated in my own backyard." The audience began to murmur, and Derek could see people throughout the room sitting up straighter, paying closer attention to his words. "For months, I kept my military service private because I wanted to be judged as a neighbor and community member, not as a soldier. But when my 17-year-old son was assaulted by police officers for walking home from basketball practice, when my daughter was made to feel like a criminal for playing in a public park, when my wife was followed and intimidated for jogging in her own neighborhood, that's when peaceful community member became inadequate." Derek paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his final point. "I've commanded elite soldiers in operations against enemies of America. I've made life and death decisions under fire. I've protected this nation's interests in places where failure meant death, and now I'm going to use every skill I learned in that service to protect my family and this community from the kind of systematic oppression that I fought against overseas." The room erupted in applause, with people standing and cheering. Derek could see tears in Mrs. Chen's eyes, pride on Bob Peterson's face, and shock on the faces of the city council members. Councilman Hayes looked like he wanted to disappear under the table. Mayor Richardson tried to regain control of the meeting, but the damage was done. The story had fundamentally changed. This wasn't just about a concerned parent fighting police harassment. This was about a decorated war hero whose family had been systematically targeted by the very people sworn to protect them. Patricia Williams was frantically taking notes, knowing that Derek's revelation would be the lead story on every news outlet in the country. Dr. Foster was smiling, understanding that Derek had just transformed their civil rights case into something much more powerful. But Derek wasn't finished. He turned back to Councilman Hayes, who was clearly struggling to process what he'd just heard. "You called me an outside agitator, Councilman Hayes, but I've given more for this country than most people ever will. I've earned the right to live peacefully in any community in America. My family has earned the right to be treated with dignity and respect, and this community has earned the right to have police officers who serve and protect all residents equally. Derek returned to his seat, and the room remained standing and applauding for several minutes. The rest of the meeting was essentially meaningless. No one was paying attention to anything except what Derek had just revealed. As the meeting ended, Derek was surrounded by neighbors offering support, reporters requesting interviews, and community leaders wanting to shake his hand. The shy private government consultant who had moved to Willowbrook 6 months earlier was gone, replaced by the commanding officer who had led soldiers in some of America's most challenging military operations. Lisa looked at her husband with a mixture of pride and concern. "Are you ready for what comes next?" she asked quietly. Derek looked around at his community, his neighbors, his children's schools, the streets where his family should feel safe to walk. "I've been ready for this fight my whole life," he said. "I just didn't know it would happen in my own backyard." The revelation of Derek's military service changed everything. By morning, the story would be national news. The police officers who had harassed his family had unknowingly targeted one of America's most elite soldiers. And Derek Thompson was about to show them exactly what that meant. The morning after Derek's revelation at the city council meeting, his phone started ringing at 5:30 a.m. The first call was from CNN, followed by Fox News, MSNBC, and dozens of other media outlets. The story of a decorated Delta Force commander whose family had been systematically harassed by police had exploded across national news. Derek stood in his kitchen, making coffee and watching the news coverage on multiple channels. Every major network was running the story, using phrases like, "American hero fights police harassment," and "decorated soldier battles discrimination at home." The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 20 years trying to stay out of the public eye, and now his face was on television screens across America. Lisa came downstairs, already dressed for work. "The hospital called," she said quietly. "They're sending security to escort me in and out today because of all the media attention." Derek kissed his wife's forehead. "I'm sorry this got so big so fast. I knew revealing my service would change things, but I didn't expect this level of attention." "Don't apologize," Lisa said firmly. "You did what you had to do. Our family, our community, we all needed someone to stand up and speak the truth." The first major development came at 8 a.m. when Police Chief Morrison called an emergency press conference. Derek watched live as the chief announced that Officers Williams and Rodriguez had been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a federal investigation. The announcement was clearly designed to get ahead of the story and show the department taking action. "While we stand behind our officers and the difficult work they do every day," Chief Morrison said, looking uncomfortable at the podium, "we take these allegations seriously and will cooperate fully with federal investigators." Derek recognized the careful language. It was an attempt to distance the department from the officers without admitting any wrongdoing. But he also knew that placing them on leave was a significant step that wouldn't have happened without the national attention his revelation had created. Dr. Foster called shortly after the press conference. "Derek, this is moving faster than I expected. The FBI wants to interview you this afternoon, and the Justice Department is sending a team to conduct a comprehensive review of the entire police department." "What does that mean for our case?" "It means we're not just talking about individual officers anymore. We're talking about systemic reform of the entire department. Your military service has given this story a credibility and moral authority that's impossible to dismiss." That afternoon, Derek sat in a federal building downtown, being interviewed by FBI agents who treated him with the respect due a decorated veteran. They'd clearly done their homework. They knew about his service record, his security clearance, and his reputation within the military community. "Colonel Thompson," said Agent Martinez, the lead investigator, "your military background gives you credibility, but it also means we can speak plainly about what you observed. From a tactical perspective, how would you characterize the harassment your family experienced?" Derek appreciated the direct approach. "It was a systematic campaign designed to intimidate my family and make us feel unwelcome. The tactics were coordinated, escalating, and specifically targeted. This wasn't random policing. It was deliberate harassment. The FBI investigation moved with surprising speed. Within a week, agents had interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed security footage from multiple sources, and uncovered department communications that showed supervisors were aware of the complaints against Williams and Rodriguez, but had chosen to ignore them. Meanwhile, Derek found himself thrust into a role he hadn't sought but was uniquely qualified to fill. Community leaders from around the country were reaching out for advice on fighting police misconduct. Civil rights organizations wanted him to speak at conferences. Military veterans groups were offering support and asking him to be a spokesperson for veterans' rights. The breakthrough in the case came when the FBI discovered internal police communications that were far worse than anyone had imagined. Text messages between Williams and Rodriguez contained explicit racist language and discussions about keeping certain people in line. Even more damaging were communications with their sergeant, showing that the harassment had supervisory knowledge and approval. "This isn't just about two bad cops," Agent Martinez explained to Derek during a follow-up interview. This was a deliberate policy of discriminatory enforcement, approved and encouraged by police leadership. 2 weeks after Derek's revelation, the dominoes began falling rapidly. Officers Williams and Rodriguez were arrested on federal civil rights charges. Sergeant Reynolds was suspended and under investigation. Chief Morrison announced his resignation, effective immediately, citing the need for new leadership to restore community trust. But Derek knew that personnel changes weren't enough. Real reform required systemic change, and that's where his military leadership experience became invaluable. Working with Dr. Foster and community leaders, he helped develop a comprehensive reform plan that would serve as a model for other communities facing similar problems. The plan included mandatory bias training for all officers, community oversight of police practices, body cameras for all patrol officers, and a civilian review board with real power to investigate misconduct. Most importantly, it established clear consequences for officers who violated civil rights and supervisors who ignored or covered up misconduct. "This isn't about being anti-police," Derek explained during a town hall meeting packed with residents and media. "This is about making sure police serve and protect all members of our community equally. Good officers should welcome accountability measures that protect them from being associated with bad officers." The federal settlement came 6 months after Derek's revelation. The city agreed to pay significant damages to affected families, but more importantly, they agreed to implement comprehensive police reforms under federal oversight. Derek had insisted that accountability and systemic change were more important than monetary compensation, but perhaps the most meaningful change was in the community itself. Willowbrook United had evolved from a response to police harassment into a model for community organizing and civic engagement. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now working together on everything from school board issues to environmental concerns. Mrs. Chen, now in her 70s, had become an unlikely civil rights activist, speaking at conferences about the importance of neighbors standing up for each other. Bob Peterson used his police experience to help train community members on their rights during police encounters. Dr. Foster established a legal clinic to help other communities facing similar problems. Derek's children had grown stronger through the experience. Carlos, now a senior in high school, was planning to study criminal justice in college, inspired by his family's fight for justice. Sophia had started a peer mediation program at her school, helping students resolve conflicts peacefully. "I'm proud of what we accomplished," Derek told Lisa as they sat on their back porch one evening, watching the sunset over their peaceful neighborhood. "But I'm even more proud of how our kids handled everything. They learned that fighting for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it." The story of Willowbrook had become a case study in community organizing, police accountability, and the power of ordinary citizens to create extraordinary change. Derek Thompson, the quiet government consultant who had just wanted a peaceful home for his family, had accidentally become a national symbol of principled resistance to injustice. But for Derek, the real victory was much simpler. His children could walk through their neighborhood without fear. His wife could jog without being followed. His family could live with dignity in the community they'd chosen as home. As he sat watching Sophia and Carlos play basketball in their driveway, Derek reflected on the irony of his situation. He'd spent 20 years fighting for American freedoms overseas, never imagining he'd have to fight for those same freedoms in his own backyard. But the skills that made him an effective military commander, strategic thinking, calm under pressure, and the ability to inspire others to fight for a just cause, had served him well in this very different kind of battle. The fight for justice in Willowbrook was over, but Derek knew the larger fight for civil rights and police accountability would continue. Other communities would face similar challenges, and they would need leaders willing to stand up and speak truth to power. Derek Thompson had answered that call to service once again, proving that the oath to defend the Constitution doesn't end when a soldier takes off the uniform. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not in distant countries but in our own neighborhoods, by ordinary people doing extraordinary things in defense of justice and equality.